everyone, and welcome to Samanthropolitics, a show where we talk about global politics and women's rights. We have a great show coming up.
On the military for the genocide against the Rohingya. So
as these poor people are being attacked, people are hiding in their offices. You guys saw a guest.
We're going to be talking about Burma and Russia today, but just a quick U.S. Native American Secretary of the Interior. Now, this is really monumental because
I'm Samantha Carlin, your host of Samanthropolitics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Samanthropolitics live from Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to be here today with three amazing guests. We're going to talk about Afghanistan, and then we're going to go straight into the news of the day, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict, which is heating up as we speak. News changing time and time again. Samanthropolitics is your source for a deep, nuanced look at United States foreign policy from a feminist lens. So thanks again for watching, and let's get started. So a few weeks ago, we talked about Afghanistan, and we said, what is the impact going to be of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, or even just not the withdrawal, but even just President Biden's announcement that we would be withdrawing? We had some really interesting perspectives. But what's happened is that there's been an uptick of violence even in the last 3 weeks. Really, really sad thing happened. There was a bomb attack that was at a girls' school in Kabul. The death toll is now 85 girls, and another 147 people were wounded in front of the Syed al-Shuhada school. Now, a car bomb was detonated, and then this part just blows my mind, no pun intended. As the girls were rushing out to leave school, 2 more bombs exploded, knowing that there would be a panic. The imagery is just awful. These girls' shoes and notebooks, just for going to school, and it just shows how much the Taliban has against women's education and how threatened they are by women in education. And it's a really sad omen for what is to come. Now, there's also just generally been a big escalation of Taliban attacks since the U.S. announced its withdrawal. I want to bring in one of our guests from our show on Afghanistan, whose piece in Politico, which is hot off the press, really outlined strategies to help us keep political pressure on Afghanistan and try to mitigate the violence and the rise of the Taliban to the best of our abilities. And she is the former Deputy Chief of Mission at the United States Embassy in Afghanistan, Annie Fortheimer. Annie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
So Annie, your reactions on the bombing of that school?
I have some friends who live in that neighborhood, and they are really beyond words to see children being pulled out. And as you said, their notebooks left behind. There was a little girl who wasn't killed. She's in the hospital. And she said, it's really important that you get my notebook because my dad can't afford to buy a new one. She wants to go back to school. It's the Afghanistan that I really treasure, which is very brave people trying to live ordinary lives.
And the Taliban just not interested.
Correct. And there is no clear idea of who was behind the attack. It also could have been other groups. That's the problem, is that the Taliban's incessant violence has opened the door to other terrorist groups. I mean, the Afghan government is pinned down trying to handle what's happening, and other terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda are present in Afghanistan and also capable of this kind of terror.
So do you think that this type of attack is linked to Biden's decision to withdraw troops and making that very visible and vocal?
I think it's linked in a way, yes, because it's linked to the fact that there is a widening vacuum being created by the uncertainty of the way the U.S. is handling this withdrawal announcement. We have not done enough to put our support, verbally, vocally, and of course, there are lots of other ways to support, but we have to show more attention to the symbolic and psychological side of any war. And right now, the Afghan government feels abandoned, the Afghan people feel abandoned, and the Taliban and other terror groups, they feel emboldened.
So you just published this piece in Politico where you outline 4 specific strategies that the U.S. can do to maintain political pressure and leverage in Afghanistan. Can we go through those?
Sure. First and foremost, support to the Afghan National Security Forces. They are the protectors of the constitutional order, and the constitutional order is what protects women and minorities. And the support that we give them, which is financial, is also, it has to continue even if no U.S. troops are on the ground. This is the way that we guarantee a little better chance of stability. The second area is that there are continued sanctions against Taliban leaders because they are destabilizing Afghanistan. And those sanctions have sometimes been discussed as something that we might try to lift as a bargaining chip. And now is not the time to put more advantages in the Taliban's corner. Now is the time to keep those sanctions.
What do you mean that we would try to lift those as a bargaining chip? Was this to get the Taliban into negotiations? Was that the language?
The sanctions were part of the agreement between the Trump administration in February of 2020 and the Taliban, that if the Taliban performed certain functions, the U.S. would withdraw its troops and we would work. It has to be done with other countries to get those sanctions lifted because they're at the United Nations. Of course, the Taliban honestly has not fulfilled its side of the bargain. We're on the verge of withdrawing our troops, but they're still, working closely with Al-Qaeda, and they haven't participated in peace talks in a substantive or positive way.
Right, and you made the point that they dropped out of the Istanbul peace talks right after we announced the withdrawal.
Exactly. That was, everything was on to bring them to the table, all kinds of inducements, and they said, really, in effect, why should we?
So let's go through the other strategies. So we talked about assisting the Afghan National Security Forces, and then we just talked about sanctions. Do you think that we should, you also point out the possibility to do targeted sanctions against the Taliban? Is that not in our toolbox, or have we not done that before?
We've done it before, and the sanctions that I'm talking about, the UN, they're also targeted. Nobody is sanctioning, for example, an industry or a part of the economy that would hurt large numbers of people. These are against individuals, and they prohibit them from traveling or having bank accounts. So they're very targeted. And we could add more. That's entirely within our legal and diplomatic right. So yeah, sanctions are one of the tools that we have left, and we certainly need to keep it and maybe even increase our leverage.
A little bit. Now, what about, you also talk about that we need to work more together with Pakistan and Central Asia. What's the thinking there, and what do you envision that working together to look like?
I think there are a lot of efforts that are underway, and I commend some of the work of the diplomats at the State Department. They are really trying. But Pakistan has been universally unhelpful in taking that final step towards bringing the Taliban to substantive negotiations. They show up, they sit down, but nothing is happening. And Pakistan, maybe it does or doesn't have all the leverage. It has enough. And there are many ways to handle this. There aren't that many punishments, but I think making sure that Pakistan and the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, understand that this is a top priority for us, that would go a long way.
Lastly, you talk about basically saying that we won't recognize a Taliban government if they don't retain basic human rights of citizens. But what I'm confused about is, do you think that would actually impact them? Be like, oh, U.S. isn't going to recognize us. We're all of a sudden going to start treating women equally and not abrogating human rights.
Surprisingly, it has come up so frequently in their public conversations, private discussions with diplomats, that I included it because it has some meaning to them. They remember what it was like to be pariahs back in the 1990s. And even 2 days ago, the special envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, gave a big interview in a German paper, and he mentioned that recognition would be withheld and the Taliban would be isolated if they don't contribute to ending the violence and, of course, being respectful of human rights. Now, I should mention the Taliban has offered a 3-day ceasefire that will start this week during their Eid holiday. However, it's a 3-day ceasefire. So I don't think that means that we have reached another point towards peace.
So they still, want to be relevant in the international community. I mean, do you think the Taliban they must have been flattered that we finally were like, all right, we said we wouldn't negotiate with you forever, but like, hey, what's going on? Let's talk.
I think they were, and it was probably correct to begin the conversation with them at this point. If we were going to reach a negotiated settlement, they did have to be in the picture. I just disagree. And as I mentioned in the article, I think that we lost leverage. Yeah. And that leverage serves our purpose as well as the purposes of all these innocent Afghans. If we want stability, we do not want to deal with the consequences of what could happen if this security vacuum breaks open and there is a war of all against all. And I'll just mention that the neighborhood where this bombing took place, people are starting to think about self-defense groups.
What does that mean exactly?
It means arming themselves because they're worried that the security forces can't be everywhere and can't save their girls from terrorists. But it means that everybody's going to pick up a weapon.
Yikes. So that could get messy real fast.
Yeah.
Last question, Annie. What do you think that these attacks on girls, that this is going to keep going? I mean, are we going to see more of these? And is there anything that we can do besides the aforementioned strategies to mitigate that?
Well, these are not the first attacks. So unfortunately, I have to predict that there will be others. There were attacks against high school kids. There have been attacks against girls in other occasions. I am very afraid it will happen again. I mean, as I said, first and foremost, the Afghan security forces need to be equipped and ready to defend the Constitution and everyone's right to do things like go to school.
Well, thank you so much, Annie, for coming on the show and helping us to understand this further. And
thank you.
I think your comment about, now that we've had the troop withdrawal or announced this, we have to figure out, okay, how else do we put pressure on and keep leverage? Because that's no longer part of our lives. And so we have to ramp up these other efforts in order to replace that.
Exactly.
So
thank you so much.
Really appreciate you coming on again, and hopefully we'll see you soon, but in better circumstances.
In better circumstances. Thank you very much.
Take care, Annie. Good night.
Good night.
All right, everybody. That was the former Deputy Chief of Mission for the United States Embassy in Afghanistan, Annie Pforzheimer, giving us a little update on Afghanistan and how do we maintain pressure and leverage on Afghanistan, even if come September, we no longer have quote unquote boots on the ground. Difficult situation there. Can't stay forever in Afghanistan, but at the same time, what happens if there's this huge vacuum and now you have self-defense forces and people arming themselves? I mean, it sounds like it could turn into Lord of the Flies overnight. Not a great situation. And it's just sad. Just girls trying to go to school and learn. It's just such a simple thing, and getting murdered. Just awful. Oh, all right. So we're going to go on to the main thrust of our show, which is about Israel and Palestine. Now, Israel and Palestine right now are mired in conflict that has not been seen in years. Things are not getting better. They actually, by the hour, there's new news that things just keep escalating. Now, there's been over 1,000 rockets that have been fired into Tel Aviv, and Israel also doing airstrikes on buildings in Gaza. Israel says that they're buildings that housed Hamas. People of the Palestinians say these were residential buildings. There's a usual back and forth of nobody being able to, accept any accountability for anything. So many rockets were actually fired at Ben Gurion International Airport, which is Israel's main airport, that it actually is shut down. Israelis are hunkering down in bomb shelters overnight, terrified. Though the death toll has actually been higher in Gaza because Israel has this Iron Dome interference system, which literally attacks rockets mid-air. So I just want to show, if you could play, Zach, video number 6, the video of the rockets that are being fired towards Israel, please. The Iron Dome interference system basically attacking the rockets mid-air. Zach, if you could play video number 7, please. Israel's response, if we could show video number 8 of Israel leveling that building in Gaza.
تعتبر هذه الصواريخ إذا أترك لك أن تعلق على ما يجري الآن أهم من أي سؤال الصور تتحدث.
Pretty unbelievable. I mean, that footage of that building just going down like is wild. The Israelis say, well, we warned people not to be there and to evacuate, and Hamas doesn't do that. They're trying to target civilians. That being said, there have still been dozens of Palestinians killed in those airstrikes, so not all the civilians are gone. Now, how did this start? What started all of this? Well, we're going to go back to the root when we have our guests. But in this particular situation, this explosion of conflict started with Jewish families claiming ownership of 6 homes in Sheikh Jarrah, which is in the eastern part and the Arab part of Jerusalem. The Israeli Supreme Court was actually supposed to rule on it this week in terms of what was definitely going to happen, who's going to get ownership, and they actually postponed the decision due to the escalation of violence. This brought tensions up extremely high between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Palestinian protesters then threw rocks, bottles, and fireworks at Israeli police after evening prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which then prompted Israeli police to fire rubber bullets and stun grenades inside the mosque, which was really not a good look, especially during Ramadan. Not a good look to fire any sort of things into a church or a mosque when people are praying. It doesn't look good for anybody involved. Now, Al-Aqsa Mosque Complex in Jerusalem's Old City, it's one of Islam's most revered location, but it's also the holiest site in Judaism, known as the Temple Mount. So if we could show that video number 1, Zach, of what happened at Al-Aqsa Mosque. You, Zach. So as you can see, total chaos. If anyone ever has been inside a mosque, they're usually the calmest places in the world. They're incredibly serene. Just seeing that is incredibly startling, and I don't think it looked very good for the Arab world. So then you also had the riots that went outside of the Al-Aqsa Mosque into the compound. If you could show video number 2, Zach, which is of Palestinians shooting an Israeli police with an automatic weapon. and just showing more of the kind of chaos that we have there. Now we have the usual things going on both sides. The Israelis coming in hard as soon as they're offended, and then the Palestinians coming back at them. Let's look at synagogue. Let's look at the video of the synagogue, video number 3.
ישראל מאורעות השפעה. אנחנו לא בקישינייב, אנחנו לא בגרמניה, אנחנו בארץ ישראל. תראו בית כנסת שרוף. מוציאים ספרי תורה עכשיו, כי כל הבית כנסת נהרס. תסתכלו הכל מסביב, חרוך. שרוף, תסתכלו על הרצפה, פשוט לא יאומן. אנשים לוקחים ספרי תורה, מצאים אותם עכשיו בבתים, אין לנו איפה לשים ספרי תורה, שורפים לנו את הבתי כנסת. תתעוררו.
Now, Beit Knesset means synagogue. That was, you could see the top of the ceiling, how unbelievable that was, that Palestinians lit this synagogue on fire, and you could see people pulling out the tochas. There's also chaos near the Western Wall. Let's look at video number 4. In that video, you can see the Israeli flag being replaced by the Palestinian flag. All right, I think we're going to end the videos now because, yeah, what other videos do we have, Zach? Just play whatever's left. All right, well, I guess that's it. So just you can see the level of chaos that is happening right now. It is a mess. So to help us understand what's going on better, our 2 amazing guests, Ben Cohen. Ben Cohen is the senior correspondent of the Allgemeiner. He's also writes extensively on the challenges posed by anti-Semitism around the globe. He is a specialist on Jewish, Middle Eastern, European, and international affairs. He's been published by The Wall Street Journal, Tablet, The New York Post, Moment Magazine, Haaretz, Fox News, and I can't even finish this list, but at least 1 million publications. He's also appeared on Fox, CNN, Al Jazeera, Arise TV, NPR, and Voice of America. None as prestigious as Samanthropolitics, but, you know, what can we do? And before moving to the U.S., Ben worked for the BBC as a producer and reporter. He reported from Bosnia during the 1992-95 war. If anyone has read Samantha Power's book, Education of an Idealist, there's a romanticized photo of Ben in there dangling a cigarette in Bosnia with a flak jacket on. He has 2 books, Some of My Best Friends, A Journey Through 21st Century Anti-Semitism, and The Norman Garris Reader. He has also worked for United States Jewish advocacy organizations. He served as the ADL's Director of European Affairs and for the American Jewish Committee as a policy expert on anti-Semitism and as Associate Director of Media Relations. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Samantha, thank you for having me on.
Delighted to see you. Delighted to have you here. So without further ado, let's bring in our second guest. Jennifer Atala is the founder of Anar Strategies, a global consultancy. She's led country-level engagements in Palestine, Jordan, and Israel, and curated partnerships with Fortune 500 and 1,000 companies. She speaks regularly on Israel-Palestine economic growth and tech innovation. She's been featured in the Jerusalem Post, I-24 News, etc. She also served on the USAID Compete project in Palestine, where she managed investments in 7 industries and building alliances. In DC, she also led investment process work at IFC. She also managed a program in Afghanistan at USAID. And she also has done work in Egypt and led civil rights advocacy efforts for Arab Americans and Palestinian Israelis. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Samantha. Good to see you. Happy to be here.
So I'd love to get both of your perspectives on, you know, why did this particular incident lead to such an intense conflagration?
Well, I think you've had a conjuncture of a number of events at a conjuncture. You've had the end of Ramadan, which is, you know, the holiest month in the Muslim calendar, and has been in the past an occasion for these sorts of confrontations. You've had, as you mentioned in your intro, Samantha, the legal conflict over Sheikh Jarrah and the outstanding Israeli Supreme Court decision on those properties. You also actually had recently Quds Day, which is an Iranian-sponsored annual event that's dedicated to the destruction of Israel. Quds, or Quds, is the Islamic word, Arabic word for Jerusalem. And Quds Day is an annual event staged by the Iranian regime, which is very sort of bloodthirsty and eliminationist, if you like, in its view of Israel. So you have all these events at this conjunction, and I think this is one of those conflicts where, if enough of these sparks come together at a certain point, you are going to get, unfortunately, the sort of escalation that we're seeing now.
Jennifer, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to consider when you're trying to understand what's going on in Israel and Palestine is that you can't really both sides the issue. As I think you displayed with the video montage, you're always going to find horrific examples of violence and chaos and anger coming from various, perspectives on the ground, whether they're Jewish or Jewish Israeli or Jewish settlers, Israeli settlers, or Palestinians, whether they're Palestinians in the territories, in the occupied territories, or East Jerusalem, or in Israel. And in terms of what we're seeing right now, and so on the one hand, what Palestinians in all of these different areas, because they experience different realities in each of these spaces. So Palestinian Israelis, East Jerusalemites, West Bankers, and Gazans, each face a different set of realities vis-a-vis their control by the Israeli government. And that has been consistent throughout time since the establishment of the State of Israel. What you see now is simply a flare-up, right? And I think that Ben was right on with some of the examples there. I mean, we have, the evictions in Al-Bustan. We have, the Israeli authorities, including, members of Knesset advocating for the expulsion of families from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. You have, obviously, lots of, I think COVID probably plays a role here too, for everyone in the world, but lots of tension coming out of that. I mean, Israel is obligated by international law to take care of the civilians that it occupies, and yet it has even been known to deny access to some of the vaccine. So there's just definitely a lot of tension happening. And as Ben rightly noted, I mean, to have the kind of police brutality that we saw, for example, at Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the last 10 days of Ramadan, which are known to be sort of the more holy days of Ramadan, et cetera, and then all of the various events that are happening, the street fights that are happening by extremist, Jewish Israeli mobs and by Arab mobs. It's definitely sort of very quickly built up one on the other.
If I can just quickly clarify my point, because I don't want to make it look as though my argument was that the Israeli police are entirely to blame for what's happened in the Al-Aqsa compound. I think the willingness and the repeated willingness of young Palestinians, especially who worship there on Fridays, to turn a holy place, a sanctuary, into a war zone is just as much, if not more, and a more important factor here. So I don't think that, the fact is that the violence that you're seeing at the Al-Aqsa compound is not the unilateral result of Israeli police action. They are responding to general lawlessness and general violence in the compound.
It seems like it's, again, that a lot of the times it started, Palestinians start with something small, and then Israel just goes in and is like, poosh, like, don't mess with us. Like, but it's an outsized response. Like, why do you think, do you think that's correct? And why does Israel have to does Israel really have to level entire buildings? It seems just like a little bit outsized for the degree of what's happening.
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, we need to shift our mindset and how we think about the people in the place that we're talking about, way beyond, the bills getting proposed in Congress, and way beyond sort of sitting from wherever we are and pontificating on the status, right? People just want to be treated with dignity and respect, and people want to feel safe. There is generational trauma on all sides. and people want to be heard, no matter which people we're talking about. I think if we start with that and with this idea of prioritizing the protection of the human security and the human rights of everyone on the ground, that will shift and also be more successful in terms of our U.S. foreign policy in the region. I think for sure, absolutely, the sort of excessive use of force by Israel it's absolutely excessive. If you just, people have the right to defend themselves, sure, but so do the Palestinians, right? And I think a lot of times that the argument is made, well, Israel has to defend itself. I mean, as a Palestinian Israeli myself, I've run up and down to the Mamad myself plenty of times. I've, had family members almost get killed by rockets. And I was on the phone last night with a good friend, in Tel Aviv, and emailing with family and WhatsApping with folks, on all sides. And everyone deserves the right to be safe. But at the same time, if you look at the imbalance of power, again, you can't both sides it in the sense that it's not two equal powers at play. Israel is one of the most advanced militaries in the world. Palestinians don't have shelters to run down to, and Palestinians in Israel also don't, because of the lack of economic resources given to 20% of the population. It's less than 5%. There's a whole lot of structural levels here of discrimination and occupation, and I think we have to remember that. If you just look at the sheer numbers, right? The Iron Dome saved a lot of Israeli citizens. At the end of the day, on the Al-Aqsa Mount, I think 300 people were injured, something like that. And it was also journalists and medics. It wasn't just youth in the mosque. You look today, just now, when I was Googling right before we started talking, I think we're up to 65 people, including 14 children in Gaza dead, 7 Israelis dead, also at least 1 child. None of that is okay. But we also have to think about the fact that these aren't two equal powers, at war here.
Ben, what do you think? Do you think it's excessive force that the Israelis are using?
I think if we're going to look at structural inequality, then there's another fundamental factor that we have to remind ourselves of, which is that Israel is a nation of 5 to 6 million Jews in the Middle East, within the greater Arab world. And Israel is exceptional in the sense that it has been able to fulfill what many other non-Arab, non-Muslim minorities in the Middle East would also like to fulfill, which is a degree of political independence and a degree of sovereignty. So in that sense, yes, it is unequal, because Israel represents a Jewish minority in an area that has a decisive Arab and Muslim majority. And the Jews are not the only non-Arab minority or non-Muslim minority to have suffered the consequences, if you like, of greater Arab nationalism. It's a very similar situation for the Kurds in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. Some of the smaller religious minorities in Iraq, the Yazidis, for example. All these small communities have had to deal, to a greater or lesser extent, historically, with greater Arab chauvinism and less rights because they are not Muslims and they are not Arabs living in those majority societies. So I think Israel actually represents an exception to, in some ways, the broad sweep of modern Middle Eastern history, and a very admirable one. I also think that if you're going to talk about this purely from a military perspective, well, then, yes, of course, Israel has an army and it has an air force. It also has a navy, which is useful when it comes to Gaza, of course, Gaza being on the port. And so Israel is going to has those, if you like, conventional military avenues at its disposal. What I think you're seeing with this sort of asymmetrical warfare from Hamas is it's a different type of warfare. And yes, in the sense of volume, it is perhaps less lethal, but it is also a lot more random. These rockets are not targeted. They can land anywhere. One actually landed today inside a shelter in Israel, and the shelter, unfortunately, was not strong enough to withhold the impact of that rocket. And a child of this was in Sderot in the south of Israel, on the border with Gaza. And I think a young 6-year-old boy was sadly killed as a result of that rocket attack. So you're dealing with random rocket attacks, and we've had in the last 24 hours or more over 1,300 rockets aimed at civilian targets. Obviously, I agree with Jennifer. I would like to see the end of this conflagration immediately. I wouldn't want to see any more bombing raids into Gaza any more than I would want to see any more rocket attacks on Israeli civilians, in the sense that our ultimate goal here is for these civilian populations to live with a degree of security and safety. However, we are now in a situation where the Israeli military is saying they want to finish the job, and they are not putting an end date on this operation. Now, to an extent, that might be.
Just to stop you for a second, what do you mean by finish the job? What is that?
Well, I'm talking about in their terms. In terms of declaring an end date to this operation, when they feel satisfactorily that they have dealt satisfactorily with this threat from Hamas, then they will end these operations. And what the Israeli military has said is, we're not giving an end date for these operations yet. Now, that may just be part of the tactics of war. You don't tell your enemy what it is that you're going to do. You don't share information with your enemy. It also just may be a signal that we're in for a longer haul here. Remember, when we had the war in 2014 in Gaza between Hamas and Israel, that lasted through July and August of 2014. You go back 7 or 8 years previously, 2008, 2009, again, December, January. So we've had a couple of sort of 2-3 month wars in Gaza. At the moment, there is justified fear that we could be in for another one. I personally think it's too early to tell, however.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Thoughts on, the UN is now saying this could evolve into a full-blown war. What do you think the likelihood is? Because I don't see, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, Jennifer, but I don't see the Palestinians backing down, or Hamas. It seems like they're just ramping up, even with these Israeli airstrikes. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll just start with sort of the framing of who Israel is in the region. I had a conversation actually with a journalist in Israel in 2004 on Channel 2 News. I was a baby. Just kidding. I'm giving my age away. On a similar type issue, and the journalist asked me, wouldn't you rather be in Israel than be somewhere like Saudi Arabia where you can't drive? Because at the time in Saudi Arabia, you couldn't drive. And I really didn't like that framing, because Israel, I don't think, wants to compare itself to Saudi Arabia. I think Israel is trying to be a democracy, and is trying to, live, I would hope, by Jewish values, which are very respectable. But at the same time, you have to see what's happening right now, which is that it is a state, even by, now the Constitution doesn't really exist, but with the basic laws, 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, right, we now have this new nation state law. There is an actual, it's systematic and it's legal. There are a number of laws that discriminate against, just look at the Palestinian community in Israel, that discriminate against who you are based on your ethnicity or your religious background, right? And don't forget that this area is also the birthplace of Christianity. So a lot of the sort of original Christians, as we like to call ourselves, are still there. And according to all the DNA tests, have lots of Jewish DNA. So that's something to show them at the airport when they strip search us. But, I think Israel should hold itself to a different standard, one in which it embraces equality and treating people with equal rights. And under international law, it is obligated, as long as it continues this occupation of the territories, to take care of the communities that it is doing so with, right? And so that's, and I speak with a lot of my Jewish Israeli friends and colleagues, they question, why did we take this on in 67? Why did we think this was a good idea? I think, and we talking to them today and yesterday and this week, a lot of them are just as frustrated as a lot of the Palestinians that I'm speaking with on all sides about what's happening, because they don't like what they're seeing in their own state, which is a rise of religious nationalism and that is now controlling the government. I mean, I know we could also talk for hours about the current status of all of the, leading authorities, quote unquote, in each part of this area. Most recently, looking at Bibi, right, and what's happened with the Supreme Court decision and the nonstop election cycles and the inability to form a government. I mean, all of this. I think we have a leadership vacuum that is combined now with an increase in racism and nationalism at the expense of human dignity. And we're not going to get anywhere in terms of, are we going to get to another war? Yeah, if this continues like this, but let's not forget, it's not two equal actors, fighting each other here. And until, we still have living memory. All communities in this space still have living memory of what it was like in the 40s, and very different living memories, right? Very different horrible experiences. And that's.
I want to stop you there just to move, just to pick up on something that you said. Bibi Netanyahu. Ben, what are your thoughts on Bibi?
Well, I'll give you my thoughts on Bibi, but then I want to give you some additional thoughts about some of the points that Jennifer made earlier. I think Bibi will be recognized by history as a colossus, in the sense that he has his political career has spanned now 1, 2, 3, 4 decades. I was a young journalist at the BBC when he was Israeli finance minister. He has been part of my professional life, if you like, my professional career. I think most journalists my age would say that we can't really remember a day when Netanyahu was not a significant international player. And so there is a sense of course, that the time limit is up, and that he should move on. I think, ironically, the longer that Bibi tries to cling on to power now, the more delayed any discussion about his legacy will be. And his historical legacy is absolutely immense. And I think he will be up there in the pantheon of, I think future generations of historians certainly will see him in the pantheon of Zionist heroes alongside Herzl and Ben Gurion, Moshe Dayan and others. But yes, my own personal view, I would share the view of many people in Israel. I think most of my relatives there would far rather that he took an honourable retirement, or at least answered some of the legal issues that have been raised against him. But I think that's probably a entirely separate discussion. I would like to go back to this issue of Israel's status in the region and Israel's nature. I don't think that Israel ever intended to compare itself to Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Iran or any of the other states in the region which are predicated on fundamental human inequality, that are theocracies based on religious law, that persecute religious minorities, that persecute women. I don't think Israel ever saw itself as having to compete with that kind of polity. I think Israel always saw itself as a democracy in a sea of tyrannies. I know that on the Arab side of this debate, that's regarded as a very tired cliche. I'm still not convinced that there is a satisfactory answer to the question that you, Jennifer, were asked back in 2004, which is, where would you rather live, Saudi Arabia or Israel? And I think that it is, from an empirical point of view, from a quantitative point of view, but also from a sort of moral point of view as well, it's absolutely clear that Arab citizens of Israel have far greater rights and far greater scope for political action and political involvement than Arabs, say, in neighboring Jordan, in Lebanon, certainly in Syria, where you've seen an absolutely barbaric war turn half the country into refugees, near 400,000 people dead over 10 years. That is a really sort of drastic example of how Arab states have failed their citizens. in the most horrendous way. And so I think Israel looks at these sorts of examples and it fears them precisely because these sorts of conflicts are foreign to the kind of state and the kind of politics that Israel aspires to.
Now, I have a question about Sheikh Jarrah. Some are saying,
Samantha, can I ask Ben a question?
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
We can be less formal. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, so Ben, taking what you just said.
Yes.
That's giving Israel the benefit of the doubt, right? Why is Israel still an occupying power and treating its Palestinian citizenry as unequal citizens and people that they are occupying? Why would they keep doing that? Because it's not in their long-term interest. People aren't going to forget. People are going to keep flaring up. People want to live in dignity.
Yeah.
They want to live in safety. Like, this is not going to end. People just forget when you're going to Tel Aviv.
And what's your response for that?
So I'll give you an answer. I don't think you're going to necessarily like the answer, but let me try it on you anyway. I think one of the problems that the Palestinians have had with many of their supporters abroad is that I look at the discourse of Palestinian solidarity, and it's like the Palestinians have no agency. It's like they're not participants in this conflict, making decisions and living with the consequences of those decisions. So I think the reason that Israel still remains an occupying power is that it hasn't found a credible partner to hand those territories off to. And I think that, of course, as Israel has become more entrenched, now, more than 50 years since the 6-Day War. So you've had, a 53, 54-year presence in that area. Of course, that presence is going to become more entrenched. But I think the fundamental, at roots, Israel's decision to remain as an occupier is a security decision. Not necessarily an ideological one, not necessarily a moral one. I think, however, we have evolved now into a situation where parceling up this territory and having two sort of contiguous states next to each other, I do see that there are going to be complications with that because, we've not had a serious negotiating process, I think, since 2000. When the last Camp David talks, and Bill Clinton was president then, so and both of you were definitely babies back then in 2000. That was the last time we had, I would say, a sort of serious attempt to resolve this conflict.
Now, Jennifer, what are your thoughts on the fact that the Palestinians really haven't had really good leadership, and then you have Hamas kind of representing Palestine, and then Abbas, and it's like who's playing, who's in the game for the Palestinians in terms of being a credible partner to hand things off to? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I wasn't a baby in 2000. I was there in Israel. Just missed the October 2000
right, of course.
situation.
Yes.
But I don't agree that Israel should continue occupying because it thinks that that's in its security interest. I'll tell you a very quick story. Like, when I was younger in Israel, there was a joke. It's like, we always make horrible jokes to get through things, all of us. So the joke was because, a bus could explode or anything could happen at any time. Like, people just really lived for the day. So people were just taking stuff in the grocery store aisles. And it was just no one could think beyond the next day because of the trauma of worrying if you're going to die the next day. It's kind of like that all over Israel and Palestine. But I think that's the problem with the politics, is that we're not thinking beyond the immediate short term. We are not going to, and I don't think Bibi is either the right person to be leading the negotiations on the Israeli side by any means. But I think that's the problem. Continuing occupation of another people. If the roles were reversed, and and your ethnic group was continually discriminated against and occupied, and all of the things that come with that, including not being able to get resources, not being able to have freedom of movement, all sorts of things. Would you say the same thing, right? Like, I don't think so.
Well, I think but in some ways, Jennifer, you've given the rationale for Zionism there. I mean, all those measures, if you like, the discrimination, the racism, the slaughter, not being able to control their own resources. This was all the situation of the Jewish people before there was a state of Israel, before 1948. So I accept that that's something that the Jewish people wanted. It's something that all people want. And I agree with you that I personally would find it very hard to stomach another round of Bibi and Abbas having, shaking hands sullenly with each other and having another round of those empty negotiations. And I think you need a vision on both sides now for what it's going to look like.
Exactly what you said.
Yeah.
The Jewish people who fled the Holocaust wanted those freedoms. So they should want those freedoms for all people in this place.
But you have to be, I mean, Jennifer, I think that Ben's point that I don't really think Israel wants to be occupying. I don't think, like you said, like why did we take this?
I personally disagree with the idea that there isn't an element of religious Zionism at play. I mean, especially in seeing the politics of the moment. I mean, it's a tired argument when you're a Palestinian, because we've been seeing it from Israeli leaders for decades. The options that get thrown into the Knesset about ethnic transfer of Palestinians out of the Northern Triangle, for example, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it goes on and on, calling us a cancer. I mean, all of it, right? Like
that's all very fringe, though, Jennifer. I mean, that's not mainstream.
Not when it's members of the Knesset or the potential ruling party, right? I mean, that's where we are today. So getting back to your other question, though, Samantha, in terms of who represents the Palestinians, I don't think that the leadership in the West Bank or the leadership in Gaza or the leadership in the Knesset on the Israeli side, the Palestinians in the Knesset, I don't think they represent all Palestinians, which includes everyone in diaspora. I mean, there are refugees. We are the longest standing group of refugees as well. Like, people love to forget about this, I think. And so who represents everyone is a big question, honestly. I think when I was living in Ramallah, for example, there's a lot of discouragement and sort of disappointment. But again, you have to remember the context. They don't have the control of the entire area. They don't have full control even. So it is an important question. It is. But I think we have to just continue asking these questions and being reminded of the full context of the situation that we're in. And this is an area where, the new U.S. foreign policy leadership can really, there's a huge opportunity here. Hadi Ahmad is on a plane like right now, probably, to go and try and do some negotiations. There's an opportunity to do something different. And I really hope that we can see something different, because this is just going to continue. And I really hope that if not in my lifetime, then, the generation after me, we can see some progress that leads to human dignity and security for everyone, because otherwise.
Can I move on to I want to move on to get back to the current issue that's happening right now on the ground, if that's okay, because I know we could go on all day with debating Israel-Palestine in general. So I just want to go back to Sheikh Jarrah, that some are saying that this attempt to take these families out of Sheikh Jarrah is an indication that Israel wants to take over East Jerusalem, which is majorly inhabited by Arabs. In case they were trying to avoid this impression, the commemoration of the capture of East Jerusalem with a march on Monday probably didn't give the best impression. I'd love to hear from both of you, Ben and Jennifer. Do you think that this is indicative of, is this just an isolated incident of these families wanting to get back their homes from pre-1948, or is this indicative of a larger Jewish plan to take over East Jerusalem? Or sorry, not Jewish plan, Israeli plan to take over East Jerusalem?
Well, I think it's already happened. I mean, Israel has already annexed East Jerusalem, and Israel regards Jerusalem as a unified city. And if you go to Jerusalem, to all practical intents and purposes, it is a unified city. You travel from one side to the other pretty seamlessly most of the time, and there is no sort of visible barrier within Jerusalem between west and east. So I think in that sense, Israel wants to keep it as an open city. But I don't think Israel is trying to pretend that it is ever going to surrender the eastern half of Jerusalem. And that, I think, has been one of the intractable issues in negotiations, and will continue to be. There was a proposal, I think, back when Yasser Arafat was still around, of having the Palestinian capital in Abu Dis, which is, as I'm sure Jennifer knows it's a town sort of just outside Jerusalem. But I think since that proposal was mooted and rejected, no one has come up with another alternative. I think it's very unrealistic to assume that the Palestinians will give up their claim on eastern Jerusalem. Equally, I don't think the Israelis are ever going to concede to the idea of a physical division, and I stress a physical division of the city again. I think if we could sort of team up and have some creative ideas about sovereignty in a unified city, where you don't necessarily need to have physical separation, if you like, that could be productive. But again, I think whilst we're in a situation where, and I think this is what's been most depressing about the last 3 days, is that you have seen real hatred exploding between Jewish civil society and Arab civil society. Netanyahu said today, to his great credit, it is not acceptable under any circumstances when a Jewish mob attacks an Arab, and it is not acceptable under any circumstances for an Arab mob to attack a Jew. We've seen horrifying scenes in Lod, in central Israel, of synagogues being burned down. A burning synagogue has a particular trigger for Jews, like it or not. When you see a synagogue deliberately set on fire, you think of Germany in 1933. That is something that is indelibly marked on our consciousness. And so that was something very disturbing to see. Equally, I want to say that as a Jewish supporter of Israel, as somebody who's lived in that country, who has family there, I was really, really shocked and horrified to see the video today of an Arab motorist, I think in Bat Yam, being pulled out of his car by a Jewish mob and beaten really savagely. So, when we start talking about creative approaches to sovereignty, we have to remember this is sadly the context. This is sadly our point of departure. A lot of people, including the Israeli President Rivlin, are saying we're better than this. Jews and Arabs are better than this. We can come together. I really hope that's true. But I think we've seen a very dark side of this conflict in the last 3 days, and that hatred between communities means that any political solutions are, they're always going to be sort of half measures, I think.
Yeah, I think, and what Ben says about the feel on the ground of Jerusalem is absolutely true. I mean, the light rail has now extended, and you can seamlessly move from West to East Jerusalem in that sense. According to, again, like I know international laws, it may or may not have its weight, but Jerusalem is supposed to be this protected city, and East Jerusalem is still considered occupied, and I'll tell you, East Jerusalem always is very unique. When we say Palestinians, we separate Palestinians and East Jerusalem for a reason. So they pay taxes to Israel, but they also don't get all of the services that those taxes are meant to provide. For example, right? If you are a Jerusalemite with a Jerusalem ID, if you leave to study abroad here in the US, for example, a lot of times you're never allowed back. There's just a lot of, East Jerusalemites are treated in a very particular way by the Israeli government. And that's part of this long history. And then you look at the absentee law, this long history of what we're seeing now with all of the settler colonialism in East Jerusalem, now with Sheikh Jarrah, right? And it's not that they're coming to that these families want their homes from pre-48. They actually live there.
Right.
Like, there are people who live in their homes, and literally, there was also a video going around, I'm sure you've seen it, of a settler, an Israeli settler who was like, well, if I don't take it, someone else is going to take it. And the woman is like, I live here. Like, this is my house. Like, what, and if again, like, it just, in terms of trying to see, I really try myself to see as many, just sit back and like reflect on how would I feel if this was me? I mean, if that was you, how would you feel? So there's, that's what's happening right now. And it's, again, part of a deeper history and a lot of overt things you see in the news and a lot of subversive things that you don't see in the news, like the thing about paying taxes and not getting services. But, if we think about today, where we are today, and this can apply to the settlements as well, the Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and you think about, the quote unquote facts on the ground, there has to be justice and accountability. Otherwise people won't ever move forward. There will still be hatred. But you also have to recognize where we are today. And there has to be some kind of conversation that takes into account all of these different factors.
Can I ask you a question, Jennifer? Because you talked about, you made a very interesting point about the different experiences, about the fact that different peoples have different experiences in the region, that there are differences between Gazans and West Bankers and Jerusalemites. Could you not argue that one of the problems that has historically that the Palestinians have faced is that we've always tried to find a one-size-fits-all solution? And maybe we're beyond that. Maybe one of the reasons that it's hard for Palestinians in Jerusalem to press their case as Palestinian Jerusalemites is because they're held back by the sort of wider Palestinian cause. They have to think about Palestinians in the West Bank. They have to think about Palestinians in Gaza. They have to think about the right of return. I don't think having the right of return, which is very much a disputed right for Palestinian refugees and their descendants from the 47-48 War of Independence, I don't think having the right of return introduced into a debate about trash collection in Eastern Jerusalem or provision of educational services in East Jerusalem, I'm sure both of which the Arab residents of Jerusalem have legitimate reasons to complain. Why have the right of return? Why have all that ideology intrude on that? Make your case as Arab Jerusalemites. I think that is going to be much more powerful.
I think that is happening, to be honest. There are Arabs from East Jerusalem, Palestinian Arabs who are, trying to serve in the city council, for example, and I think some have. So I think there is that. I think that is happening. Right. I think, and it gets actually back to an earlier point comment I was making about how people love to sort of talk in these hyperboles, but actually what's happening on the ground, people just feel differently on some level. On the other hand, right, like Palestinians, we're familially connected one to the other. I have family in all over Israel, in Jerusalem, West Bank. I had in Gaza until they got out after one of the wars. And I'm just one person, right? And so and all over the diaspora in Mexico and South America, and here in the US, I'm the one here. So, we as a people see ourselves as a people. And in that sense, that is going to continue. But I do think on the micro level, there are definitely localized actions happening, as well in the West Bank, for example, in terms of local politics of people trying to challenge the status quo there. And I'm not as familiar with what's happening in Gaza and how people are trying to challenge Hamas, which I know is happening, but it's probably difficult. As well as people, and this is where I started my career working, to try and gain equal civil rights under Israeli law as Palestinian Israeli. So that is happening, but I think all things are sort of happening at the same time in different layers.
I think that's a really interesting point, though, of thinking putting all of if there are these different populations, putting all of them into one bucket. Maybe it's too much in terms of let's get things done on a micro level for East Jerusalem, and then talk about a two states. I feel like because the language, we don't hear much, Jennifer, about East Jerusalem, people living in East Jerusalem not getting equal citizenship or equal rights or, studying abroad. We hear about a two-state solution and Gaza and the West Bank and in Israel. And so I think it is really interesting, Ben, bringing up that point of these nuanced populations, and then how do those populations kind of work together to achieve the lowest hanging fruit, and then moving up to whatever that highest hanging fruit is. I want to move the discussion over to United States foreign policy. Ben, you we just left the joke of the Trump administration, which heralded itself as the Nobel Prize winners for solving Middle East peace. They did absolutely nothing about the Israel-Palestine issue, instead deciding to butter up Israel with some of the other countries. You just published an op-ed on your opinion on the Abraham Accords, the famous Kushner-Abraham Accords. He's clearly best diplomat that ever existed. Can you talk a little bit about your opinion on the Abraham Accords?
Sure. I wrote a piece called, Will Truth Be a Casualty of the Abraham Accords? Because I was arguing in that piece essentially that the diplomatic relations that have been created now between Israel and a whole load of Arab states, that requires, peacetime war requires you to tell certain lies, and I think peacetime also has its own lies. And I think one of the consequences of Israel signing these agreements with particularly these Gulf countries is that it puts the discussion about the treatment of migrant workers in these countries, the use of slave labor in the Gulf, it puts it even further on the back burner. Now that modern democratic Israel has signed a peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain. But let me just take a quick step back from that. I'm not opposed to Israel signing peace agreements with these countries. In general, I think peace agreements are a good thing. But I think there has been far too much fanfare for the Abraham Accords, because frankly, they were a deal that was waiting to happen. It was fairly easy to assemble. Israel has had good commercial ties with Oman, with Bahrain, with the UAE, going back now into the 1990s. I think, and possibly Jennifer might have some more to say on this, I think that you've seen a sea change in the Arab world over the last 30 years in that Arab countries, I think, have become more hostile to the Palestinians and more tired, if you like, of this ideological war against Israel, which for most of them is a country that is thousands of miles away and doesn't pose any direct threat to them. So I think there were very powerful impulses on both sides to come to an agreement. And I think that is, why this particularly inept White House was able to make that deal. I don't think it was certainly a historic deal in the way that Egypt-Israel was, or indeed if we go back to 1994 when you had Rabin signing agreements with Yasser Arafat and King Hussein. Again, I don't think it's a historic breakthrough in that sense, because the sides were already aligned with each other. None of these Gulf countries are going to go to war with Israel. And crucially, I think they have the common interest of confronting Iran. Now, again, another truth, Iran is a real and tangible threat to both Israel and the Gulf countries. I think Iran is a threat to the Palestinians because the type of politics it represents.
Do you think there's kind of a hypocrisy, Ben, of doing the Abraham Accords, but at the same time pulling out of the Iran deal? Like if it was part of it was countering Iran, but at the same time we're pulling out of the Iran deal, which regulates their making nuclear weapons?
So you in what sense? You mean that they were, the two things were tied together?
That they were, well, that was counterproductive policies. Like if you're trying to offset Iran through the Abraham Accords, is then pulling out of the Iran deal, isn't that counter to pushing off Iran? Because that actually emboldened them to keep building nuclear weapons.
Well, look, I mean, I can say you can certainly make that argument. I think the issue with the Iran deal was that, frankly, when Trump pulled out, it was already in a fairly weak place, and you had all these conflicts between the Iranians and the IAEA and the European countries about access to nuclear sites in Iran. So the agreement was struggling even before Trump pulled out of it. I think, look, the main problem, I think you can have reservations and strong reservations about the Iran deal and still not take Trump's diplomacy seriously, because I think most of the things that Trump did, whether domestically or on foreign policy, was all about grandstanding and all about projecting his own brand. So I don't think there was any sort of serious policy rumination, if I can use that word, ruminating going on.
Jen, do you have any thoughts on the Abraham Accords?
Sure.
Why not?
I thought, Ben, I haven't had the pleasure of reading your piece yet. I'm sorry. I thought that was an interesting point, though, about the leverage regarding the human rights abuses in some of the Gulf countries. I haven't heard that one yet, so that is interesting. Yeah, I mean, lots of thoughts. I think, so first of all, if you are at all familiar with the region, you already know that business was happening between the Gulf countries and Israel. That's not actually, like, that's not new. Like, it's just been under the table. You know, I think obviously there are things that have changed now with this. I do think that the geopolitics of the region is really the driving factor here. And I think that could raise some potential concern regarding potential, you know, proxy war or letting go of holding Israel accountable for its abuses of human rights, letting the Gulf countries go for their, you know, abuses of human rights, for example, because of this greater purpose. So I think that's something to watch. From the Palestinian perspective in general, there was, you know, a lot of sort of continued disappointment in the sense that, you know, at the time, especially when if you recall the sort of threats that Bibi was making. And by the way, point on Bibi, he may have said a good statement about this, but there's so many bad statements, like, you know, the thing about Arabs are coming in droves to vote at the polls and things like that. But yeah, you know, at that very moment, it was a unique situation, right, regarding settlement expansion. And so I think, you know, on paper, we've lost some leverage in terms of there being hope that the Gulf countries would hold Israel accountable to some of these human rights abuses and the continued occupation of the Palestinian people. But also, Palestinians are not dumb. So no one's really thought that the Gulf countries were going to be their savior for a very long time. So I don't think that was expected. But they are not a powerful people. They don't have a state. They don't have a military, really. You know, so there was some lost hope there and some real disappointment in, you know, the fellow brethren of some degree. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Jennifer, something else that we talked about on the phone was how Ned Price in the press conference, his kind of inability to answer questions. You told me it went viral across the Arab world. Can you talk about what exactly happened and why you think that is?
I can give you my opinion. I don't know why it is, but I can give you my opinion. You know, I have a lot of empathy for Ned. He was in an impossible situation. I mean, he's in a position where he doesn't have a lot of leeway in what he can say or not say. I think he did a pretty good job. But I think that the administration can do a much better job of how we're talking about the conflict. I think a lot of times we've seen this over and over again, and we're at the beginning of this administration. So I think there's just a lot of hope that we'll see something different. And the difference being, you know, an equal attention at least to, you know, the rights and the dignity of everyone. And I feel like, again, it becomes this both sides false dichotomy when it's not two equal players here. And there needs to be some significant verbiage around, you know, stopping settler expansion in East Jerusalem, for example, and the excessive use of force. And sure, everyone needs to be safe and civilians should not be murdered. Like, this is a given. But we need to have some serious, you know, this is a serious moment and there's a real opportunity. And so, you know, I think, so this video, so as Samantha mentioned, just for your audience to know, we talked about it briefly. You know, I'm obviously in a lot of different communications groups with people in the Middle East and Palestine and Israel. And yeah, the video went viral. And of the last press conference where he was speaking with some of the journalists in the audience who were very frustrated, and understandably so. And I think it's viral because we're waiting to see what would happen post-Trump. We're hopeful and just continued to be disappointed. And honestly, we saw this as well at the very beginning of the Obama administration with the attacks on Gaza. The broader Arab community and especially Palestinians didn't feel like they got the support that they deserved and didn't feel like they were heard or treated with equal respect and dignity. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not over yet, right? I mean, we have Hadi going over there now. We'll see what happens in the coming days. And I think he can only say what he's allowed to say, and he can't speak for things beyond what has been already validated in terms of reports from the ground. And so it wasn't an easy thing for him to have to do, for sure.
What do we think U.S. policy should be? I mean, we've been talking about the two-state solution forever. It still hasn't happened. I mean, from a broader perspective in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I mean, Ben, what are your thoughts on what is reasonable for a Biden administration to try to do for the next 4 years?
Well, I think you also have to consider that question against all the other tasks that the Biden administration is facing over the next 4 years. And I think it's fair to say that we are going to have a very domestically focused political agenda in this country for 4 years, and with good reason, frankly, given what we've been going through here. I also don't think that solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the sort of shining city on the hill that it once was. I think it's definitely lost its mystique.
Do you think because people are sick of it? They're just like, I'm done with this. This never ends.
No, I think it goes deeper. I think there was a prevailing belief, actually, until quite recently, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the key to global stability, and that if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was allowed to get out of hand, it would gradually, unwind throughout the world, because, of course, this is Jerusalem. It's the heart of the three great religions, and so on and so forth. And so I think the fact that people thought that the Palestinian issue could trigger a world war was a very powerful card for that cause, if you like. It kept it front and center. But I think that what you've seen in the last decade, and the Abraham Accords are actually a good example of this, is that you can have political change in the Middle East that isn't predicated on self-determination for the Palestinians. I mean, in other words, the Palestinians will see this as a betrayal, because Arab states, and it's not just Bahrain and Bahrain and UAE, it's also Sudan as well. It could well be Saudi Arabia in the next year or two. They have basically done what they promised they would never do, which is to recognize the Jewish state and to have bilateral relations with the Jewish state without the Palestinian question having been resolved first. So I think there's very little left in the equation that will give us the kind of configuration that we had in 1973. Certainly in a war between Israel and the neighboring Arab states, I really don't see. And so I think if there is another war, frankly, it's going to be along the lines of what we're seeing now, and very destructive, possibly bringing Hezbollah in from Lebanon. And so therefore you're talking about armed terrorist groups, Hamas and Hezbollah, facing off against the Israeli Defense Forces. I think the implications for that for civilians on both sides are an absolute nightmare, frankly. And I think that really is the kind of configuration we've got to avoid. And that's why it's important on both sides, I think, as well, to have some kind of flexibility about our historic beliefs, and maybe abandon some of these concepts that we're very attached to.
Jennifer, something that you've mentioned is the influence of China, Russia, and Iran as this kind of new bloc. What do you feel like the influence of that is on this whole situation?
Sorry, I was so focused on continuing the previous conversation.
Do you want to pick up on what Ben said? That's fine too.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'll just plug really quickly, and I had nothing to do with it, but I respect the people who did. The recent Carnegie report. Carnegie put out a report called "Breaking the Israel-Palestine Status Quo: A Rights-Based Approach." So I recommend to your viewers to check that out.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I think when we think about U.S. foreign policy, we need to have some clear assertions that if the two-state solution is still something that is potentially viable, then the U.S. role in that should be to clearly assert that any further disenfranchisement by the Israelis of the Palestinians needs to stop. And that includes settlement expansion and et cetera, and things that we've already talked about on the show. Working with the PLO on reforming payment systems, for example, and some of the other recommendations they made in that report, I completely agree with. But I also think that, further down the road, perhaps we really have to think about what one state would look like. And I know it's a really unpopular opinion amongst a lot of the Jewish community. But I think, again, sort of going back to the grocery store example, we have to think ultimately about the long term, and I'll say there's also, remember, within the Palestinian community, we are one community, but it's also, Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, and within that, every variation, right? Just as with the Jewish community, it's a whole variation of what it means to be Jewish in Israel. And so we have to remember that as well when we're thinking about who we're speaking for. In terms of the geopolitics, I think getting back also to the comments about the increased hate, we can make comparisons about the role of misinformation and disinformation all day long. And I think that's playing a role here in America, and it's playing a role in the Middle East. And the way that technology works such that you are seeing only certain types of information. I think, and we are also seeing intentional bad actions by some of those actors, in particular Russia, obviously, but also China. I mean, I'll tell you right now, I had a hard time finding gas today in North Carolina because of a cyber attack. So these are issues that are not isolated to the U.S. And I do think that we are going to continue to see alliances and relationships through this prism of what that means vis-a-vis China, Russia, and Iran, and where they are, entrenching and building their own resources and bases, and how that looks on the ground in the Middle East, and not just in Israel and Palestine, but where many of the Palestinian refugees are, in Jordan, obviously in Syria. So I do think it's going to play an important role, and we need to, and it needs to. China's playing a huge role in the Middle East. It's a huge role in Israel. I mean, Israel-China trade is enormous. And there's that factor as well. So there's a lot to dig into here, but it will be at the forefront, I think.
My last question for both of you, and I think this idea of disinformation, or just self-fulfilling cycles of information. As I was preparing for this show, I searched Twitter #Palestine, and every single thing that came up was Palestine under attack, the Israelis are terrorists, blah blah blah. And then as soon as I do, and it's all footage of stuff happening in Gaza. And then you search #Israel or #Israel under attack, and it's the total opposite side. But there doesn't seem to be any nuance. And you even hear that. And I told both of you when I was doing this show, I didn't want to have two hardcore activists because they don't listen. And they don't, they don't appreciate the nuance. No one's willing to accept any accountability for any sorts of actions. Israel doesn't want to say we're doing anything that could potentially be wrong. And the Palestinians are like, we're in occupied territory, we're the victims. So how do we change that narrative of people trying to understand a little bit more the nuance of the situation, and that it's not just you're the bad guys, we're the good guys, or vice versa?
I mean, the scope of that question is absolutely enormous, Samantha. I think that most right-thinking, civilized people like the idea of multinational cosmopolitan societies where different nationalities and different religions live alongside each other. And if you can pull that kind of social arrangement off, the results could be fantastic. But if that social arrangement unravels, and I saw that, back in Bosnia 25 years ago, which was in many ways a highly integrated society, Muslims, Serbs, Croats, all intermarrying. Most people growing up in modern Yugoslavia didn't imagine that these old conflicts would reemerge. But yet, today now in Lod, we're seeing Arab Israelis attacking the synagogues of their Jewish neighbors. We're seeing a Jewish mob drag an Arab man out of his car and beat him senseless in the street. So you're seeing the unraveling of those social fabrics. And I think, to be honest, where peace initiatives can work is in terms of how do we preserve those social fabrics? How do we keep a minimum of hatred? I also think that, look, you know, in terms of, if you're talking about outside interventions in this conflict, I don't think the Palestinians have really done themselves any favors or been helped by many of the outside powers that have sponsored them. You know, during the Cold War, they were very much in the camp of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union delivered zilch for the Palestinians. It delivered some horrible resolutions in the United Nations, like Zionism is racism, for example, which is where you get the first comparison between apartheid. It was the Soviet Union who actually invented that comparison between Israel and apartheid South Africa. But you didn't actually get any tangible results. And I look now, who are the outside powers that are supporting the Palestinians? Erdogan, dictator in Turkey, who's locked up more journalists than any other leader in the world. You know, you've got the Iranian regime. You've got Nicolas Maduro, who runs a completely illegitimate regime in Venezuela. These are the outside powers that come out and speak out on behalf of the Palestinians. And I think the fact that the Palestinian cause is sadly still inside this bucket of sort of, you know, tyranny causes, if you like. It's not helping the situation, and it does not communicate to Israelis and supporters of Israel that there's a serious, you know, a resolution that will allow us to live together and respect each other, while you have the likes of Venezuela and Iran and Turkey in the background.
Jennifer, last words.
Yeah, I just want to point out that until very recently, the United States leadership was in bed with a lot of those same leaders. So I would take that comparison with a grain of salt. Yeah, I'm still reeling from that, I think, as we all are in some level. Yeah, I was so stuck on that. I'm trying to recall what we've been thinking about before this. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if Israel wants to attempt to be truly democratic and provide equal rights and justice for all, I welcome Israel to do that, but they haven't done that yet. And it's just getting worse. And Palestinians are still living under occupation and systematic discrimination. And so, you know, it hasn't happened yet. And you mentioned apartheid. I mean, I know it's a big topic at the end of a conversation, but
yeah, I don't even want to go there. I really don't want to go there.
I'm sorry, that was Martha.
We won't go there, but I do think it is worth reading the Human Rights Watch report, or at least the summary, and you know, talking about listening and thinking through different options and different ways of viewing the conflict beyond what we're used to. It's worth listening and digesting that report, and to get to the conversation of, you know, what we're seeing in civil society on the ground right now. I really, really strongly believe, again, I've mentioned this before, that we have to learn how to respect each other and then build trust. That's like any relationship. You go to a therapist, they're going to tell you that, you know, marriage counselor, like, but I think like that's what's going to happen. That's what needs to happen here as well. And until there is space for that, and there's a lot that goes into creating that space, there needs to be safety for everyone. There needs to be accountability, justice. Like, then we won't be able to even start that process. And I think that's what we really need. And when that has happened at a micro scale where people have come together, and I'm not talking about like eating hummus for the weekend and playing soccer, that can be fine. I'm not denigrating it either, but that's not what I'm talking about. You know, there are other ways to build respect and relationship with one another. I think we have to do that.
All right, Ben, last words.
Look, I applaud any attempts that brings civil societies together and crucially helps Jews and Arabs, Palestinians and Israelis to understand their history, each other's history a little bit better. I think there are still major gaps in historical knowledge. And if you look at the curriculums in many Middle Eastern countries, they're remiss, frankly.
We have the Holocaust in Kuwait in the textbooks. It's not there.
Right. So I think I agree in the sense that I think if peace is going to come, it has to come really from a grassroots level. There was an great Irish writer and statesman, Conor Cruise O'Brien, who famously said that conflicts don't have solutions; they only have outcomes. And I think that's true to a great extent. I don't think we're ever going to see a situation where we say, right, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved. It's now over. This is now post-conflict. But I think we do have a duty to try and secure the best, most reasonable outcomes and the least violent outcomes that we can. If we can't get a permanent solution, then we need better outcomes.
Thank you so much, Ben and Jennifer. I think, having both of you on today made me feel hopeful that there can be dialogue that doesn't end in a screaming fight and people walking off the set between a Palestinian and a Jew.
Should we do that now, Jennifer? Should we kind of,
we go at it?
There's nowhere to go. You're in a hotel room. You're stuck in your apartment. But, I think it is promising is like if we can have these micro level dialogues and expand them on a larger level and see if we can come to new outcomes versus solutions. And maybe it's not, and maybe that's the problem with our whole language in the US is we're constantly talking about the two-state solution. Like it's going to be the solution to all of the problems. And that language, I think, is a little bit grandiose and not true. So thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure having you both and for, educating our audience in this incredibly rich dialogue.
Great to be here. Thank you, Samantha, for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. Great to meet you, Ben.
Nice to meet you, Jennifer. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Take care. Well, that was a great show. Frankly, hard to end. Of course, ending with Israel's apartheid state. That was a whole nother rabbit hole we could have gone down, but I wanted to spare you tonight. But that was Ben Cohen, who is an international journalist, and Jennifer Atala, and representing kind of both sides of the issues. But I really just loved how nuanced they were in their appreciation of kind of both sides and what do we need to do? How do we need to move forward? Here's hoping that this does not continue to escalate because as we said at the beginning of the show, that it has been getting worse by the minute. So fingers crossed that there will be de-escalation, that, America, our role in trying to create a ceasefire or have some sort of negotiation does come to fruition, or if not, America, another country steps up to the plate to try to put an end to this particular incident right now. If you liked this episode, please share it. Subscribe if you're on YouTube. Please like the page if you're on Facebook. Share it with your friends, your grandmother, your dog's Facebook page. I don't really care. But if you found this educational, please share this. It also enables us to get sponsors. If you are interested in sponsoring an episode, you can reach out to us on our Facebook page and just on the messenger. I also really want to thank our sponsors for this episode, Stream Inspectors, all the cool graphics, the guy in the back when I say, hey, Zach, can you please play this video? Amazing producer. Stream Inspectors are the live production studio, the penultimate live production studio. So if you're interested in live production or creating a show like this, please go to Stream Inspectors. They are, frankly, the best. Just make sure Zach still has time to do my show. That's my only request. I also want to thank our other sponsor, Candlewood Counseling. As many of you know, there is a mental health crisis happening right now all over the world. COVID has not been easy for people. I have seen people that were formerly very happy people become extremely depressed. We now have this weird thing where people are getting vaccinated, but what do they do? Because they've kind of been shut in their homes forever. If you are suffering from anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, Candlewood Counseling, amazing psychologist, takes virtual patients, so sees people virtually. also offers hypnosis to help you relax, calm down, anxiety reduction, specializes really in reduction of depression, anxiety. So we're going to put the website for that in the Facebook comments of the chat and in the YouTube comments. So please check out Candlewood Counseling and don't wait to schedule an appointment, because mental health, something that we see is the longer you wait to get help, the worse things can get for you. So please, go get help. And that's it for today. Next week on Samanthropolitics, mark your calendar again for 7 p.m. on Wednesday. We're going to have an amazing woman on our show, Farah Pandith. She was the first United States delegate to the Muslim world. She traveled all over the world trying to understand the Muslim community. And she recently published a book called How We Win, How Cutting-Edge Entrepreneurs, Political Visionaries, Enlightened Business Leaders, and Social Media Mavens Can Defeat the Extremist Threat. It's such a fascinating book, and it goes against mostly every single thing that the U.S. does with regards to foreign policy and our outsized military. It's a really creative, amazing book, and she's truly a visionary and an amazing woman. So again, next week, Wednesday, same day, same time, 7 p.m. Join us again for Samanthropolitics. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been such a great show, and we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.